Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today, Dr. Peter Cappelli. He is a professor of management and director for the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School of Business. Also the author of several books, including his most recent one called Our Least Important Asset: Why the Relentless Focus on Finance and Accounting is Bad for Business and Employees. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. At a highlight, and one of the reasons why I actually reached out to Peter is because he had an article come out a couple months ago talking about the downside of psychological safety. So we're going to start with that, talk maybe a little bit about DEI, the new role of HR, and see where the conversation goes from there. So Peter, thank you for joining me.
Good, thank you. Lots of stuff.
Yes, lots of stuff to talk about. So let's jump into this article, this study that you did. So it was called The Downside of Psychological Safety in the Workplace. Can you give a little bit of background information about the study, first of all, and what you actually found, and then maybe we could dive a little bit deeper?
Yeah, the first thing I should say is it was co-authored by Liat Eldor and Mikhail Ador, who are both at Tel Aviv University, and it's a little more Liat's article than it is mine. But here's the background to it. The idea of psychological safety is not a new thing, but it's become popular recently. It's been around for, 30, 40 years, something like that. The idea behind it is to think about situations where creativity is important. And in those contexts, it turns out that you can really mute it and make it difficult for people to be creative if they feel, frankly, you're going to make fun of them. So the phrases are things like interpersonal harm, right? Interpersonal harm means people making fun of you or ridiculing you or any of those things, none of which sound particularly good, right? So it is, you might think in general, what could possibly be good about interpersonal harm? Well, probably nothing. But the particular focus of this whole idea of psychological safety was to find situations where we could improve creativity. Right? So that's what it's about. The study we did was looking at more regular jobs. So what people in psychology call in-role behavior. I should say I'm not a psychologist, so this is all a little foreign to me. But in-role behavior, which means in your traditional job, what are you supposed to be doing in the job description part of it? Mainly, right? So what do you do every day in your job? So creativity stuff is typically not in-role behavior. It is the kind of stuff that we do occasionally. Unless you're, in an advertising agency or something like that, you're not doing this stuff very often. So it struck me as a little odd that the assumption was that psychological safety just was always good, and the more of it, the better. And it just seemed to me a little odd, partly because the dimensions of psychological safety include things like, do I feel like I will be punished for making mistakes? Well, there's lots of jobs where you'd say, yeah, you probably will be, if you're a nurse, for example, and you make a mistake with a patient, don't expect people to say, well, that's okay, or if you're on an assembly line
I was actually at
and you install the wrong part.
Yeah, I was at a restaurant a couple of days ago speaking at an event in Chicago. And I sat by the kitchen, and it was, a nicer restaurant. And there was a big group of people, probably 10 people, a big party sitting somewhere. And I saw one of the line cooks. He was making a bunch of steaks. And then the head chef came over, and he looked at the steaks, and he saw that they were all, he basically messed up like 6 plates of steak, filet steaks, right? Expensive steaks. And I'm sitting right next to the kitchen, just me, my little solitary table. And I hear this head chef just cursing at him. He's like, get off the effing line, like go to the back. Like he just sent them out of there. And he probably made a fairly costly mistake destroying 6 steaks, and the party was upset. And that was one of the things where I thought of when I was thinking of psychological safety, right? Because he made a mistake. He should be in some way reprimanded and punished for that. And I can't imagine a head chef at a restaurant going up to their line cook and saying, you know what, it's okay. You just messed up 6 fillets and, made them weigh, like, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it would be surprising, and it's not that psychological safety, the absence of psychological safety, means that you should ridicule people and beat them up. But it does mean that you probably are going to hold them accountable, and there's some consequences for making mistakes. If you're in a creative context, you could see why you don't want that,
Yeah.
right? Where if we're asking people to throw out ideas and your boss said, no, that's a bad one, I'm sorry, we're going to punish you for that, that would shut everything down. But in your regular everyday job, you would expect, when you know what you're doing it over and over, there are rules, you would expect that there'd be consequences if you make mistakes, right? Doesn't mean you have to shout at people, but consequences. So what we decided to do is just to look and see. So Liat had the data from many different settings, actually, it turned out, and we could see what happens when psychological safety goes up. Now, if you've got no psychological safety, improving it does improve performance. If you got none, adding it makes people perform better, even in regular
Well, it's hard
jobs.
to imagine
So
somebody
that
not
means
having
if you've got a boss,
any psychological safety.
well, the idea would be a boss who just yells at you all the time for nothing at all,
Yeah.
for example, right? And is making fun of you and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, you could probably imagine that that does happen in some places. If you could get them to back off a bit, it would improve your
Yeah.
performance. But what we saw is that when psychological safety goes really to a pretty high level, performance declines. And why would that be? Well, it seems to us the reason is because in those contexts where it's really high, you don't feel that you are going to be punished for your mistakes. You're not going to be held accountable for them. And in regular everyday jobs, you probably should. So that's kind of what we found, right? And the other thing we found, though, is that there are other things that might compensate for that a bit. If you have a kind of collective sense that what you're doing is super important, then maybe even if you got no direct consequences, you might perform pretty well anyway. If you think what you're doing is maybe life and death on people, you don't need a boss to come by and say, hey, you really should be saving that guy's life. You're probably going to do it anyway, right? But so that's what we found, is that if you push it really high in regular jobs, performance drops.
Do you want to hear something really crazy? 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. It'll literally take you 1 second, and you'll get notified when more videos just like this one are available. Now, let's get back to the content. Now, most people think of psychological safety as basically this idea of being able to talk about mistakes, failures, challenges in the workplace without being ridiculed for it. You mentioned that there's a lot of different definitions of, dimensions of psychological safety. So for most people, is that an accurate definition? It's just being in an environment where you feel safe to speak up, to talk about challenges, mistakes, failures, personal struggles. Is that an adequate definition of what psychological safety is?
Well, it is a context where you feel safe to speak up, for sure, right? And so I think that's probably right. Could you imagine a context where that goes really, really high, where you feel not only that it's okay to speak up without being punished, but that you could make mistakes, right? So that's sort of the key difference. You wouldn't imagine there's anything wrong with feeling that you should be able to speak up. But you might imagine that it starts to be a problem if you think it's okay, even if I make mistakes, that nothing's going to happen.
And how do you actually measure psychological safety? Are there a series of objective metrics that we could look at to say we have too much, not enough, or is it very subjective as far as how we measure this?
No, I mean, it's psychologists have scales for things and they do surveys. So they ask you to fill out a survey that says, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? How much of this do you think you have? How much of that do you think you have? So, to the extent to which you can capture behavior, it's about as good as any other measure we've got, as good as job satisfaction, as good as engagement, as good as any of those sorts of things.
All right. So this is particularly interesting to me for a lot of different reasons. So one, I'm even trying to remember, if you were to go back, obviously Amy Edmondson, she wrote that book and she helped popularize the concept of psychological safety. But to your point, I think even 20, 30 years ago, there were other people who were addressing it and talking about it in the space as well, some researchers. But even before this
Right.
concept of psychological safety existed, if you were to go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, um,
Yep.
I mean, did we just not talk about psychological safety? Did it not exist? I'm trying to understand, how important is it? Like, if we didn't talk about it, we didn't address it, we didn't measure it, there were no books about it, would there be a substantial difference inside of organizations today? Or is this just,
Yeah, so right. That's a good question. And I think if we went back 50 years ago into the sort of 1960s, there's a guy named Douglas
yeah,
McGregor who had a fundamental dichotomy about how people think about management. And he called one of them Theory
theory Y?
X. And Theory X was kind of a rational economist view of things, that carrots and sticks, that's what makes people go. And Theory Y was basically a more complicated view of human behavior, probably more accurate view, right? That said people care about lots of things, including how you treat them and fairness issues and that sort of stuff. So with Theory X, yelling at people is perfectly acceptable. With Theory Y, it wasn't. So I think the idea that, there is management that pays attention to human dimensions and types that don't is pretty fundamental, has gone back a long way. Psychological safety is, you might say, a pretty small subset of that bigger distinction. Should you pay attention to the human and psychological attributes of people and their interests in things? And I think everybody would say yes. Psychological safety was a pretty small slice of that. If you had a good Theory Y exercise, would you need people to pay attention to psychological safety to get good results? Well, probably not so clear. Maybe it's capturing within that. But again, psychological safety as it was created is really about these contexts where you need creativity. And creativity is different because in creativity, you need to be willing for people to make mistakes and to say things, for example, when you're trying to get good ideas that might sound dumb. Right. So that's, I guess, what's really different is we started to think about situations where that's important. So until, we started to get teamwork and quality circles and that sort of stuff, you didn't care much what workers thought. You weren't asking them for their advice. You weren't trying to brainstorm at all. So it got to be a big deal where brainstorming and, asking employees to come up with ideas became a big deal.
So as I was saying, I think there's probably too much psychological safety with a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, and we don't have enough strong leaders who are willing to step up and kind of take action. And there's a book by Abigail Schreier, I believe her last name. It's called Bad Therapy. And in the book, she talks about how what's happening is that a lot of parents have been kind of outsourcing their parenting to therapists. And what happens is we overdiagnose kids, we prescribe them medication when they don't need it, and we kind of hover over them and we coddle them. And it seems to me like what's happening is we're seeing an extension of this inside of our organizations. And so a couple of days ago, I was sitting with a group of 5 leaders, all running very, very big organizations. And we were talking about this and having a conversation around, is it possible that we are investing too much in well-being, too much in a lot of these programs for employees? Because what starts to happen, at least what I am seeing and what a lot of leaders are telling me, is that when you do everything for your employees, they will do nothing for themselves. So if you have because we talk about always, how can a company create psychological safety? How can a company engage you? How can a company create purpose and meaning for you? How come we never talk about the role and responsibility of the employee? Why isn't it the employee's responsibility to help shape their purpose and meaning? Why isn't it their responsibility to take care of their well-being? So if you're an employee who goes home at the end of each day, you're watching TV for 10 hours, you don't have any time for social activities, you're not eating healthy, you're not exercising, and then you show up to work and say, hey, I'm disengaged, I'm unhappy, I'm miserable, fix me. Like, where's the accountability for the employees? And so I'm wondering if we're at a point now for a lot of organizations where we've gone too much, where we're trying to do everything for employees and employees are not wanting to do anything for themselves.
Yeah, I thought you were going in a different direction, so I'm not sure about that. But I'll tell you the direction where I thought you were going and where I do think we have a problem, and that is about relativism. as opposed to having leaders who would say, for example, this is the direction we're going. I'm sorry, we've all got to go this direction, right? And instead they say, I don't know, where would you like to go? And we want to tolerate this behavior and that behavior, and however you want to behave, that's perfectly fine.
Yep.
I see that issue a lot, and that does seem to me to fit into this idea of safety broadly defined. I don't want to call anybody out for anything. I don't want to tell anybody that they're doing anything wrong. It's all about counseling, right? So I guess to that extent, it's the same sort of thing you were saying. I teach a course for MBA students about how to supervise people. And this is about formal authority. And we spend a lot of time in required courses teaching people how to get along with each other. And this is about being a peer, right? And being a peer is a lot about tolerance and about, give and take and all that sort of stuff. But if you're a boss, that is not what you're doing. You're telling people what they have to do. You're trying to do it in a way that, is going to allow them to want to do it. And you shouldn't be a jerk about this, but you do have to make people do things they don't necessarily want to do. And that is quite a different exercise. And my experience with students is that they find that surprisingly difficult to do. And I think that's because they've spent so much time in these groups thinking about how to get along with each other and how to get along with in a team context. We were all peers, right? So I guess I was thinking what you were describing is that in many organizations, we have a lack of clarity about what is it that we want to do. You can see this especially now in something I've been spending some time around is remote work, right? So companies are struggling to get people to come back to work. And why is that? Well, for sure, they're not telling them you've got to come back to work.
Yeah, they're scared. They're scared to say anything.
They're telling them, we'd like you to come back to work, but then they're not coming back, and why not? Well, that's pretty obvious, I would think, what the problem is there. They don't particularly want to come back to work, and if you don't make them come back to work, they're not going to come back. But I think in order to be a smarter management team, you wouldn't just tell them they got to come back to work. You would think about this as a change exercise, which is just recognizing that they're human, which means you got to start by telling them, here's why it's important to come back to work. Here's the reason for it. We're not just being arbitrary. This is affecting our business, and that is why there's real pressure for us to come back, because things are not working as well as we thought, right? So you could make people to come back, but you'd like to make them come back in a way where they're okay with it. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason not to do that. But I think what we do see is a little too much lack of clarity about standards, lack of clarity about what we want you to do, and an unwillingness to sort of back that up. I think there is a lot of that. And I'd say that has a lot to do with this kind of relativism. But a lot of it, I think you're right, has to do with this idea that our goal should be to kind of counsel people. And I find our MBA students think that their mission as a supervisor is to be the support, the counselor, the therapist almost for their direct reports. And I try to tell them, don't do that, in part because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it's not your job, and you don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
So
it seems to me like the most important aspects of any successful job for an employee would be obviously pay, career growth, advancement opportunities, working for a leader who's coaching and mentoring you, having clarity on the vision, knowing that you're making an impact. And then it seems to me, and I partially blame a lot of the tech companies in the Bay Area for this, because it seems like that's where a lot of the trends started, which is ironically, they're the ones that are having the most trouble retaining employees. And then we started adding all these things on top of it: free food and yoga and car washes and well-being programs and financial counseling and gyms. And it just became so much that we are forgetting about what work is supposed to be about. And I'm not saying that it's bad to take care of your people, but when you make that the core focus and you push the work aspects as secondary, I think you see all sorts of crazy things. Even the Gallup studies numbers that just came out. We're at an 11-year low for employee engagement. Half of employees are still, even though they have full-time jobs, they're open to looking for jobs elsewhere. So we're putting in so much money in engagement programs, in well-being programs, in all of these things, yet engagement is still at a low for the last 11 years. Your employees are still wanting to go elsewhere. So part of me wonders if we need to just take a step back and just focus on the basics of work and jobs and careers and stop overemphasizing so much of this other stuff. And to me, I would imagine that if employees have that core aspect of work and the job stuff there, that'll be more of a primary motivating factor for them instead of all this other stuff that we're sprinkling on there.
So I do think that at the leadership level, we're doing things which are really quite hard on employees, particularly this restructuring, constant talk about having to move things around, which means people are worried about losing their jobs. And with some reason, because, there have been some layoffs. They're not all that big, but nevertheless, you could be the one, right? So then we sort of expect human resources to come put a Band-Aid on it. And we tell them do that with these wellness programs, which are pitched at mental health. They're not really pitched at dealing with mental health, clinical problems. They're dealing with stress, basically.
Yeah,
right?
I call them adrenaline shots. We give adrenaline shots, temporary spikes in engagement, and then the adrenaline shot wears off, and then we're back to being unhappy again.
Yeah. And some HR people cynically say you're passing out brownies and coffee too, right? While waiting for things to happen, like you're the Red Cross at a fire. So I think there's something to that. And back to your original point, I think you could probably get pretty far with a healthy organization if you had leaders that were trustworthy and were clear about what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And you could see, what does that mean for me? What is it you really want me to do? And we didn't have to worry too much about the relativism stuff. Does this work for you? And, psychological safety in the sense of not holding people accountable for things. If you think, if we think that that's what's going on, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, I talked to one CHRO who she's running a 7,000 person company, and she took over a couple of years ago. And I asked her what's going on with her company, and she says we're transitioning from creating a company for children to creating a company for adults. And the way that she explained it is that there was a period of time where employees were getting salary increases and promotions regardless of any kind of demonstration of performance. Employees were getting like $1,000, $1,500 credits to spend on stuff. It was free food. It was everything. It was Pinocchio's island, basically. And she said it got to the point where we as a business were looking at this financially, and we're realizing that we are actually losing money because of all the stuff that we're investing. And we were struggling so hard to keep these people here that we put in so much money that it started backfiring. And she says, now we're cutting back on all that, and we're creating an organization for adults. And I can't help but wonder, and again, and these were 5 massive, massive organizations, and they were telling me that employees, they don't even want to become managers anymore. They want more salary and more pay, and they don't even want to show up to the office. And a lot of them, I hate to say it, but entitled. And I think it's partially because we don't have any leaders who are able to say, are you crazy? Like, are you seriously asking me for that? Like, that's nuts. Like, no, we can't do that. Yes, you do need to be in the office. And I don't know what happened to leadership around the world and why we've gotten to this point, but to me, it just seems a very not sustainable way to keep going.
Yeah, I think, so I got another view as to what happened there. I mean, if you turn back the clock 50 years ago to a typical corporation then, there were all kinds of reasons why you felt loyal to the company. And that had to do with the employer in the past having taken care of you. The employers did things for you, but they also advanced you in the company. And by the time you got up a certain level, you've achieved some things, and you did it all through the company, and you're loyal to the company. We've moved now toward a model which is much more plug and play. So if you look at a U.S. corporation now, they only fill 15% of their vacancies from within. You look at this is ADP results, about a typical employee starting out, only about 2% get a promotion every year, which is astonishing. It used to be regular promotions and things, right? So, and companies have managed in the slack periods before like 2018 or so, with a lot by, there were fear of layoffs and such. Now we move to a tight labor market. And the employees, not surprisingly, don't feel very much loyalty to the company. And they see companies talking about restructuring and you may be gone. And there's still some of that, talk from the older period going on. And so they're pushing and they're asking for things. The things they want, they're not crazy. Of course, I'd like more money. I'd like more time off too. They're not just completely nuts, but they don't feel that loyalty to say, okay, I'm working for the good of the company here. I don't feel that. And why? Well, the company never looked after me before. So we've moved toward this plug and play model. And now for the employers, this is a real problem because people don't have loyalty because they weren't shown any loyalty. And now they got some bargaining power and they're pushing back. And the employers are afraid that, people are going to quit. And so, oh, we don't want that. So, oh my God, we can't hire. So now they're yielding on all kinds of stuff, like the one I see most prominently. You got to come back to the office. Oh, you don't want to? Okay, well, we won't make you.
It drives me nuts. That absolutely drives me nuts. Part of me wonders, like, let's say we didn't have any of this stuff. We only focused on, let's say, a couple things. Like, if you work here, we'll pay you well, we'll treat you well, you'll have advancement, coaching and development opportunities. That's it. We don't have well-being programs. We don't have free food. We don't have unlimited vacation policies. None of that stuff. We just focus on the work aspects, and you're going to have what you need there. You'll have the purpose and meaning. We're going to, help you identify how the work you're doing is making an impact. We'll give you these opportunities. We'll challenge you and push you, but don't ask us about this other stuff. Wouldn't that kind of an organization still be just as successful, if not more successful, than another company that's saying, by the way, we have an on-site therapist and we have a gym and we have free food? Like, none of these are work-specific aspects.
I think probably right. The problem right now, though, is that companies have got themselves in a position where they don't do any training. They don't do development for people. They don't offer them careers. They don't offer them stability.
And they do the other stuff to supplement it.
And they do and so it also means it's probably not doing it much good. If you're not paying me all that well and I don't have development opportunities, I can't see a career here, throwing brownies at me and chair yoga is not going to make very much difference. So why bother? Right. So I think that's a problem. And we got bad management, a bad management of employees. We've taken supervisors, we make them individual contributors. We don't actually require that supervisors pay much attention to their direct reports. We don't hold supervisors accountable for that. We don't give them time or training either. So a statistic I've been seeing, depending on the survey, as many as 59% of managers say they never had any training before they became a manager on how to manage.
Not surprised.
They don't know what they're doing. So, guess what? They're bad at it. If we spend some time doing the nuts and bolts stuff, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, you wouldn't need all this fluffy stuff on the other side. I think so.
I just wonder if there's any data that exists on this to kind of make these comparisons. I think that would be like really interesting to see how much are we spending? How much of an impact is it having? Because when I interview CHROs as well, I ask them about the ROI of these programs, and they say, well, we can't really quantify it, but it's a good thing to do. It's a nice thing to do, and our employees care about it. And I say, okay, well, how do you track that stuff? Oh, we can't really do that. So I don't know. It seems to me.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting problem. So I remember when I was working in the Department of Education, so this was 20 or 30 years ago, and we ran a center on workforce quality and trying to figure out, how do you get as an economy a workforce that's got the right skills and knows what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. And the question of training came up a lot, because training is pretty crucial if you're going to have a workforce that is effective and knows what they're doing, not just for you, but maybe if people leave someplace else too. And the question came up, about is training working or not? And you'd get this response, and then the question was, well, they probably don't know how to measure training. And some places that's probably true, that they don't know how to measure it, outcomes and things. But then it became pretty clear that they really didn't want to know. And the reason they didn't want to know was they had a strong suspicion a lot of this stuff wasn't really doing much. And if you basically found, you showed that what you were doing didn't matter, you're probably all going to lose your jobs, which was, a little worrying. What you'd like to think is a company would say, okay, let's figure out what does work.
Yeah.
and let's try it. Let's try to see. So,
Yeah. I
you're
wonder how
right.
much.
They don't know. They don't know.
Yeah. I wonder how much of this is actually having an impact. Well, I want to transition a little bit to DEI, which is kind of related to this. And I mentioned that I'm going to be talking to another professor at Harvard, probably in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
And he did some interesting studies on DEI, Frank Dobbin.
Yep.
And one of the studies that he did, I believe, was a meta-analysis where he actually showed that a lot of these DEI programs are causing more harm than good inside of organizations because they keep
Yep.
emphasizing
Yeah.
racial inequality. They keep emphasizing stereotypes. They keep emphasizing, some of the things out there that we keep talking about a lot in the DEI space. What are your thoughts on what we're seeing with DEI? Is it good, bad? Is the backlash justified? One of the things that, for example, I'm really fascinated with is, of course, we want to create a company where people feel like they can show up to work. Isn't that HR's job? Isn't that the leader's job? Do we need DEI executive officers? Do we need DEI teams? Why isn't this just a part of HR to just say, hey, we're going to hire people and we want to make sure that when you start working here, like this is a company where anybody can be here.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on all this stuff?
Yeah. So maybe back up just for a second. I think Frank Dobbin's work that is relevant here is stuff unless maybe he's done something new on this, but he was finding that companies that did more diversity training ended up with less diversity. And the reason for that was because the diversity training was basically trying to make people feel guilty, I guess is what he would describe. And it irritated the leaders, who were mainly white men. And so they just backed off and you got less of it. I think in this context too, I think it is important for companies to be clear about what is it you're actually trying to achieve here, right? And I think for many companies, what they were trying to achieve, which is perfectly appropriate, is they're trying to have a workforce that looks more like their client base or their customer base, or more like the country as a whole, right? So that is a perfectly understandable goal for employees and for everybody else to see. And so how do you do that? Well, you're limited as to what you can do there by Supreme Court cases and other things. You can't just hire people who are of color or women and pop them in those jobs. Supreme Court won't allow you to do that. Law won't allow you to do that. So what you can do is you can recruit a more diverse pool of people and then hope that more of them end up in these jobs. You can try to do things that reduce bias so that more of those candidates get in. And once you get them...
Even the bias stuff I find very interesting. And in this paper, this meta-analysis, Frank Dobbin's quoted as saying is, hundreds of studies dating back to the 1930s suggest that anti-bias training doesn't reduce bias, alter behavior, or change the workplace. And the idea of bias I've always found very interesting because it's the idea that I am not consciously discriminating somehow against someone as a result of something, and that I'm going to go through a series of training to reprogram my unconscious mind so that I no longer have this, you know what I mean? Like it sounds strange. It just sounds strange. And,
the second
from
part
what I've,
is the strange part.
Yeah. And I've been trying to find data, and there's a lot of critiques on this that say there's no kind of objective criteria on this. The training doesn't show that you're kind of reprogramming your mind in any way.
That's right.
And I don't know, can we just agree that, sometimes you'll make a mistake. Sometimes you're going to say something stupid and you need to apologize. You know what I mean? Like, it almost feels like we're trying to create this perfect utopian organization where no mistakes and none of this stuff is allowed. And there are some jackasses out there. But by and large, I don't think most people are like that. And I don't think any data supports that most people are like that. It almost reminds me of that movie. Oh man, what was it called? With Christian Bale from way back when, where you have to take a pill and the pill removes your emotion so that you show up to work and you're just kind of like this stoic robot. And the whole movie kind of unravels as Christian Bale stops taking this pill and has these human emotions. Like, we're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to do dumb things. It's just, some of these things just sound weird to me.
Yeah, well, I think so. Two separate things there. I think the first is, do people have biases which are unconscious? Absolutely. Do we have prejudices? Do we like people who are like us better than other people? Yes, we do. And as hiring practices, unless you're doing it carefully, do we tend to want to hire people who look like us? Yes, we do. So the second part of that, though, where I think you're right, is that there isn't good evidence that anti-bias training is going to do much good. So that doesn't mean you can't do anything, though, right? Some of the things you can do, for example, is just point out to people who they're hiring. You say you want this guy, these folks. Did you notice they're all white men?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on with that, right?
Yeah.
You can try to make sure that your panel of people who are doing the hiring is not just all white men. You could try to train people as to how to interview. You could try to train people as to what kind of assessments to make. You could give people systematic information on the candidates. Here's objective information about them. So we're not just relying on interviews, which are terrible as a way to try to assess. So you could get better at hiring. And companies ought to be able to do that, right? So that, I think, is much more understandable for people. I think if companies would say, look, we're trying to get a workforce that looks more like the population. We're not doing it so far. We got to fix this. What do we do to fix it? The bias training, trying to rewire people's heads, I think you're right, doesn't work well. And it also irritates people. So let's not do that. Let's just figure out, what can we do to get a more diverse pool? What can we do to make sure that our hiring decisions are objective? Because we're not doing much about that. We're just trying to give people training, right? So we could do that. And I think that's kind of sensible. I think the other aspects of DEI are confuse people, and I think confuse me as well. Okay, we're after inclusion and equity. I don't know about that one. I don't know that I think you could have diversity without inclusion and equity. And what's your goal here? Is it diversity? That's my sense of what employers are really after, is diversity. So it's kind of confusing people,
What is lumping everything together? Like, I'm all for having people with different perspectives. If you're listening to this podcast, I'm willing to bet that you are interested in excelling in your career. Maybe you're interested in becoming a better leader. Maybe you're trying to figure out how to future-proof your organization or to create more engaged employees. If you really want to step up your game and get more insights, more strategies, more tips, and actionable things that you can apply, then you should head over to greatleadership.substack.com. We have a community there of tens of thousands of people from around the world who every week are getting access to exclusive and bonus CEO interviews with global best-selling authors, leadership tips and hacks, and in-depth guides that I write every single week, where I'm sharing a new leadership insight, a strategy, something that I have come across that's going to be relevant and valuable to you in your leadership and career journey. So head over to greatleadership.substack.com. You are not going to want to miss this opportunity. When I give talks sometimes to leadership teams and it's 200 like older white guys in suits, I take notice and I'm like, okay, that's a little, what happened here? How did that happen? Why don't you have different perspectives, different backgrounds there? So I understand the aspect of, but even that is probably not the right way to think about it, because what if it's 200 older white people in suits who come from different parts of the world and have different perspectives? Like, is that okay? Right. So even that is challenging to kind of wrap your mind around. And again, the whole unconscious stuff, I would imagine, and I'm not a evolutionary biologist, but I would imagine that there's some kind of like evolutionary positive side of wanting to surround yourself with people who are like you, that you identify with. That's where you had safety. And it seems like we're just trying to, I don't want to say manipulate our minds a little bit, but maybe we're looking at it making things too complex, like making things much better than they need to be.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. I think the problem is if you were somebody who was trying to figure out how do you get an organization to advance more people, hire more people, and advance them, and you think that what's going on right now is discrimination, which is a kind of bias.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you do about that, right? And so I think, understandably, they were trying to figure out how to de-bias people. The problem is, as you say, implicit and unaware biases. There's not a lot of evidence that at least the implicit bias measures predict actual bias.
Yeah.
So could you train people to not act on their biases? You probably could, and that's a good thing, right? To be able
Yeah.
to do that, as opposed to trying to eliminate their biases in their heads. And the best thing you could say about implicit bias stuff is to make people aware of how they are inclined to act, so they can do something about it, right?
Yeah.
People can learn to behave better. If you think
Yeah.
about men and our relationships with women over time, men in the business world are much better at the way they treat women now than they were when I began my career 40,
Yes.
50 years ago.
Yes. Yes.
People can change their behavior. That doesn't mean your head is rewired, but it means you've learned to say, this is not the way to behave, right?
Yeah.
So we could, and I think that is a distinction which is important, to tell people, we're not interested in what's going on in your head, but here's how you got to act. I think that's a reason to do. But back to the equity and inclusion part, right? That is a little hard to get our hands around as to why they have to go together. They're not bad things to talk about. Inclusion means, how can we make sure that in our day-to-day interaction, once we get a diverse workforce, let's say, that we are not being sort of childlike in kindergarten in our behavior, where we only hang out with our folks here. Can you be aware of other people's emotions and things, and that you're not excluding people? Yeah, you can. Now, you might say that is manners.
I was going to say, part of it is like how you're raised, right? I mean, if you're raised to not be a schmuck, so to speak, it's
yeah. Schmuck sounds like it's perfectly appropriate in this context, and captures it pretty well. So as a company, could you tell people that, look, don't isolate people. You got to include people in your conversations.
Yeah,
don't
I tell my 7-year-old daughter this at school.
Yeah, right. So could you do that? Yeah, and it's not that complicated. The question is, do you have leaders who will show people that here's how we're behaving when they go to a social event? What do they do? How do they interact with people? Everybody's watching you. They'll start to copy you, And do you need a big program about that? Probably not. Probably not going to work anyway. The equity thing is an important one in terms of what do we mean about that. I think what we really mean about that is something like meritocracy, which is hard to object to. We're going to have standards and say, here's how we promote people. Here's what we want you to do. Here's what you get rewarded for. And it's fair and objective, right?
That's the big pushback against DEI. Is a lot of people make the critique that DEI is sacrificing meritocracy in favor of lowering standards so that other people, disadvantaged people of color, people who come from different communities or different socioeconomic statuses, so that they can succeed. We lower standards so that they can thrive. That's the argument that's made from a lot of people, right? That we're getting rid of meritocracy.
Right. And of course, that violates the law, right? You're not allowed to treat people differently based on their demographics. And that means not only are you not allowed to discriminate against groups, you're not allowed to advantage groups either, right? Based on these attributes. So I think, there's nothing wrong with those principles. Let's try to be fair with people and meritocratic. Let's try to include people in our social interactions. Let's try to have a diverse workforce. Pretty straightforward. I think we have kind of fetishized them, though, And back to your original point about, do we need entire divisions to do this, and offices and things? I think I think inside organizations, there's a tendency to create positions to show that you're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of performative, Of course, we have a DEI officer. There's evidence that we're taking this seriously, right? But it's also true. It's like organization culture. Could you have an organization culture officer? You could, that's a worthless job, because there's no way anybody lower in the organization is going to be able to change the culture of the organization. Right? Culture is about the norms and values of a place, and we learn it by how people actually behave, not what they say. So you could have your organization culture people talking about, values and norms and things. Doesn't matter at all to
Yeah.
the culture. And for DEI, a lot of the same thing, right? If you really want to change the way we hire, your DEI officer isn't going to do that for you. It's got to be the people at the top who say, here's how we're going to hire from now on. Here's what we're going to hold people accountable for. If you can't recruit a pool of applicants that's diverse, we're going to make you do it, because it allows us to do that. Law allows us to do it. We know how to do it. Just go do it, right? So I think you're probably right. Do we need all these offices? Probably not. So we need all these officials? Probably not. What we really need are the leaders to pay attention to stuff. And actually, when you talk to Frank, you'll find that that's what he found as well. That what you really got changed was when the leaders said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take this seriously when we engage them. And it's a little concerning then when you see the creation of functions that are supposed to be doing the stuff that leaders can only do themselves. It might be a signal that, oh, this is a place that doesn't take it seriously, right? Because we've got these officers down here with the title. They don't have any power.
Yeah.
We're going to make them responsible for it. It's kind of the opposite,
Yeah. So maybe just last 5 minutes to wrap up. We can give some practical and actionable tips for leaders around, we can pick and choose whether you want it to be the DEI or psychological safety piece, but it's really around, how do you create the right amount? What is the right amount of psychological safety, and how do you create it? And we could also maybe look at this from a DEI angle as well. If we were to go with this kind of new way that we're thinking about it, what would be the right way to approach DEI? So maybe you could share your thoughts on the psych safety and the DEI piece for how to think about it the right way. All right, everyone, the rest of this episode is only available for subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts, and you won't want to miss this bonus episode, because we're going to actually be talking about what is the right amount of psychological safety and how do you create it? And Dr. Peter Cappelli is also going to be sharing some insights around DEI and breaking those components down a little bit and giving leaders some action items on what to do and how to think about DEI in the right way. So if you want that episode, as well as an episode every week from one of my amazing guests and ad-free listening, again, that's only available for subscribers, Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. And you can always reach out to me. greatleadership.substack.com is the community, and my email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.